Nixon's den, which he'd conceived of as a command post, was beginning to feel like a bunker. The president was exhausted and drinking heavily. In May 1970, 4 students were shot dead on the campus of Kent State University in Ohio, protesting for peace. The following weekend, thousands of anti-war demonstrators converged on Washington. Nixon felt besieged. Unable to sleep, he put on a record of Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto. Yet over the music, all he could hear were the protesters gathering on the Mall. Nixon suddenly flipped. Desperate to break out of the den, he summoned his driver. They drove down to the Lincoln Memorial, where, in the early light, he confronted some of the protesters. They were utterly astonished to encounter the president and to hear rambling recollections about his own idealism at their age. He talked of Neville Chamberlain coming back from Munich, proclaiming peace for our time.
I said I thought at that time that Chamberlain was the greatest man alive. And when I read Churchill's all-out criticism of Chamberlain, I thought Churchill was a madman. In retrospect, I now realize Chamberlain was a good man, but that Churchill was a wiser man.
May 1970 was Nixon at his worst, lurching drunkenly between defiance and self-pity, a foretaste of things to come. But this man was a fighter. Out of the wilderness, like Churchill, he crafted a triumph, finally accomplishing his grand design. Military might alone was clearly not going to end the war in Vietnam, so Nixon resorted to cold, calculating diplomacy. Better relations with Russia and China were his long-term goal. But now he also seized on this as a way to put the screws on North Vietnam, by persuading Moscow and Beijing to cut off weapons and supplies. His tactic was to make use of the growing rift between North Vietnam's 2 communist patrons. The Soviets were obsessed by China's growing military strength and soaring population, already triple that of Russia's. Russian fears about the Chinese threat were captured in one Moscow joke, which imagined a phone conversation between Nixon and the Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev.
I hear you have new supercomputer with massive predictive power. That's right. Yes, indeed. So, Mr. President, please ask your supercomputer to predict names of Soviet Politburo in year 2000.
A long silence ensues. Finally, Brezhnev crows down the phone.
So, Mr. President,
your supercomputer
not so super
after all.
Oh no, Mr. General Secretary, the names
Came up all right. It's just that
I can't read Chinese.
How best to exploit the split between the 2 communist giants appealed to the grand strategist in Nixon. If Washington thawed relations with Beijing, he reckoned, that would alarm Moscow and make it cozy up to America. And the price he would exact for these new, improved relationships would be an end to both Moscow and Beijing's support for North Vietnam. Nixon saw all this as a kind of global chess game, which, move by move, would get him the peace settlement he wanted and needed to gain re-election in 1972. He told Kissinger,
"We're doing the China thing to screw the Russians and help us in Vietnam, and maybe, down the road, to have some relations with China."
Nixon saw Kissinger as his most powerful piece, his queen, if you like, in this game of chess. After covert contacts via Pakistan, in July 1971, Kissinger flew in secrecy over the Himalayas and into the forbidden city of Beijing. Nixon could only wait impatiently. But on the 11th of July, he received the message he wanted. Kissinger had secured China's agreement in principle that the president would visit Beijing. For Nixon, this would put pressure on North Vietnam and advance his great goal of global détente. Nixon was beside himself with delight. He scribbled a message of congratulation to Kissinger. "When you return, I plan to give you a day off in compensation for your superb service to the nation." Reading this nowadays, you'd think it was a joke. But Nixon didn't do irony, just hard work.
Premier Zhou Enlai, on behalf of the government of the People's Republic of China, has extended an invitation to President Nixon to visit China at an appropriate date before May 1972. President Nixon has accepted the invitation with pleasure.
The opening to China was a stunning public relations coup, which took the world by storm. The problem for Nixon was that Kissinger gained much of the credit, turning him almost overnight into an international celebrity, depicted as the shrewd helmsman who was piloting Nixon on a dramatic voyage into the unknown. Nixon needed Kissinger as the backroom dealmaker, but he hated letting his advisor into the limelight. Nixon's pioneering visit to China eventually took place in February 1972, carefully scheduled for primetime TV back home. Just to be sure that Kissinger did not muscle in on the photo opportunity of Nixon's grand arrival, burly Secret Service aides blocked the aisle of Air Force One as the president and his wife walked down the steps and into history. The visit was a triumph of public relations, and it could only have been achieved by a notorious right-winger who couldn't be criticized for being soft on communism. Just as Nixon had hoped, his China visit loosened the Cold War deadlock with Moscow. The Soviets' great fear was being isolated if their old enemy America and their new foe China started becoming friendly. So Moscow hurriedly invited Kissinger to discussions in the Kremlin. Nixon wanted concessions on Vietnam before he would meet with Brezhnev. But Kissinger regarded a summit between the two leaders as the priority and forged ahead on his own. Back in the den, Nixon fumed impotently that Henry was simply breastfeeding the Soviets.
"Tell him no discussions of the summit before they settle Vietnam, and that is an order."
Kissinger got equally angry.
"If the president does not trust me, there is not much that can be done."
The struggle for the limelight was becoming a struggle for power. On Kissinger's return, according to the diary of Nixon's chief of staff, Bob Haldeman,
"The president was all primed to really whack Henry, but backed off when he actually got there."
this was typical Nixon. Although a tough talker in private, he loathed face-to-face confrontation. But the appeasement was costly. Kissinger had set up a summit in Moscow essentially on his terms. The messenger was becoming the master. In May 1972, Nixon touched down in Moscow. He had prepared for the summit by watching the James Bond classic, From Russia with Love. And he was welcomed, if not with love, at least with champagne. Unlike Beijing, there was substance here as well as symbolism. He signed a series of agreements with the Soviets, above all on arms control. So in 3 dramatic months in 1972, Nixon had overturned a quarter century of Cold War history, becoming the first US president to visit the 2 capitals of communism. Just 10 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when nuclear war seemed inevitable, Nixon's policy of détente, relaxing superpower tension, offered hope for an end to the Vietnam War and the prospect of a new, more peaceful world. The global chess game paid off. In 1972, Nixon won a landslide victory, being re-elected with 60% of the popular vote. But his obsessive suspicion was now corroding his judgment. More and more, the president's wary eye turned on his right-hand man. Nixon was still angry that Kissinger was getting the credit for the diplomatic triumphs of 1972. What's more, his advisor, it seemed, was openly trumpeting his success.
I've always acted alone. Americans admire that enormously. Americans admire the cowboy entering a village or city all alone on his horse. This romantic, surprising character suits me because being alone has always been part of my style. A Wild West tale, if you like.
The tubby, bespectacled Kissinger as a Lone Ranger-style Wild West hero sounded preposterous to most people. But Nixon took it very seriously. He liked to think of himself as a Lone Ranger figure, with Kissinger playing Tonto.
2 quick puffs. That's your sign, Tano.
I don't stand on protocol. If you'll just call me Excellency, we'll be getting...
Clearly, his national security advisor saw their roles as being reversed.
Mr. President, I have Dr. Kissinger calling you now.
Fine.
Thank you.
Hi, Henry. Mr. President, you in New York or Washington? No, I'm here. Oh, fine, fine. I'm just back.
Nixon, who resented sharing any of the glory, had even started taping his meetings and calls. He wanted material for his memoirs so as to shape the verdict of history. But he was also determined to protect himself against Kissinger, who often leaked distorted accounts of their conversations to the press. In due course, the tapes would prove Nixon's fatal mistake. Part of what irked Nixon was that Kissinger's jet-setting diplomacy had still not delivered peace in Vietnam. In December 1972, with the election won, Nixon reverted to hardball once again to finally clinch the deal. He unleashed 12 days of savage bombing, forcing the North Vietnamese into some final concessions, and an agreement was signed. North Vietnam acknowledged South Vietnam's right to exist, at least for the moment. Nixon had extricated America from the mess and got the boy